us who live in the United States are concerned about the polarization that we see happening, where it seems as though you've got these two sides that are pulling apart more and more, with more hatred and more contempt and more outrage constantly boiling up further and further, it seems like. It raises the question, could we ever actually pull apart as a nation? Well, David French has written this fascinating book, Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. David French serves as the senior editor at The Dispatch. He's a well-known political commentator. He served as an attorney for many years, and he's someone that I greatly admire and have learned so much from. We had the most fascinating discussion. I was so grateful he was willing to chat with me. And I learned so much from this, and I also found it just helpful for how to think, what's the way forward from here for us in our nation right now? So I hope you'll enjoy this video, and please consider subscribing to my channel. I'll be putting more videos out just like this one in the years and months ahead. David, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It's really an honor for me to be able to chat with you today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So I read, as I just mentioned to you, your book with great fascination. I devoured every page of it. I did find it frightening at times, and in particular, the second part of the book where you paint these
Yeah.
two scenarios where secession could actually happen. And these are fictional scenarios, but one of them is about California, the other is about Texas. And what struck me is that they didn't feel that unrealistic.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I just thought, this seems somewhat like an extension of some of the things that we're currently seeing. So I was curious, how likely do you think the possibility of secession actually is? And maybe also if you could just define that word. I know that's a basic question, but maybe.
Yeah. So secession is essentially the decision of a portion of the country to withdraw from the rest of the nation, to form its own country. The same thing we saw when the colonists declared independence from the British Empire. The same thing we saw when the Confederacy declared its own independence from the Union. And so how realistic? My position in the book isn't that, oh my gosh, we have to do something right now or the United States of America is going to break apart. My position is that if the United States does not change course, if we do not have a fundamental course correction from the animosity and the division in this country, we're going to risk the country breaking apart. That the way I look at it is, imagine how, you're building a bonfire and you put the kindling down, you put the dry wood down. Maybe if you really want to make sure it's going to ignite, you put a little bit of a like charcoal fluid, lighter fluid on it as well. But it's just sitting there. It's just sitting there, and it's not on fire, but it is ready to light. And the position I'm making is that we're building right now. We're building that bonfire. We are in the process of putting down the kindling. We're in the process of putting down the dry wood, and it hasn't ignited. And it's not really at this point capable of igniting fully, but we're making it. And so what I did in these middle scenarios of the book, which were designed to show how all of these ideas and all of these trends in America, how if you push them forward 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, how they could ignite, how this could actually happen. And it's kind of the make or break sections of the book, to be honest. Like if you read it and you go, nah, well, maybe I didn't convince you in part one, but if you read it, and I've had some readers say, it took me 10 pages in before I realized this was fiction. And I was like, yeah, that's okay. Then I've done my job. I'm showing how all of these various trends that I talk about in the book can lead to a real crisis, and a crisis that we're not really capable of responding to effectively.
Yeah. At what point did the thought of secession come into your mind as something that is actually something we need to think about? Is that in the last few years?
It's something I've actually been thinking of ever since, I would say, late 2015, early 2016, when you saw in the rise of Trump, and I don't think of Trump as the cause of all of this. I think if he's, it's sort of a symptom. Where you saw in the rise of Trump, there is this extraordinary anger and this extraordinary rage. And essentially, what you saw in an awful lot of people was a desire to have somebody not so much govern the country well, but fight for you. Like the fight was the purpose
Mm,
of the president. And the fight was the purpose of politics, not governance, but sort of intellectual, ideological, moral, cultural combat was the purpose. And look, there's always been an aspect of that in American partisan politics. I mean, the old phrase that politics ain't beanbag, politics has always been a rough business. But what we have seen rise over the last 20, 25 years is this thing called negative partisanship.
Mhm.
And negative partisanship is essentially defined as what negative partisanship is when you support your own party, not because you so much believe in your party's ideas, but because you despise the other side.
Mhm.
And what we've seen over time in the last 20, 25 years is the vast majority of partisans who are Democrats or Republicans are Democrats or Republicans, not because they love Republican ideas. Often those Republican ideas are totally up for grabs, but because they really despise the Democrats, because they really hate the Democrats. And I have statistics in the book that show how deep this hatred is. I mean, up to 80% plus people have described their political opponents in the most negative terms. And so it's not just that we're dividing and that we're disagreeing with each other. We're dividing and that we just despise each other. And you just can't keep going in that direction. The anger can't, you can't continue to stoke more anger without there being real consequences.
Well, I want us to describe that polarization a little bit more. But first, in the first portion of the book, you talk about some of your experiences and the way
Mhm.
they've affected your perspective on all of this. And I was interested in your time in Iraq and how that
Yeah.
changed your thinking. You were deployed in 2007.
hmm
How did that influence the way you think about partisanship and the ideas in this book?
Yeah. So that's a good story because it really sort of shows it shows how perspective can raise your sense of alarm about what's happening in this country at the same time that it can decrease your partisanship. So before I deployed to Iraq, I was always a civil libertarian in the sense that as a constitutional lawyer, I believe that every American should be entitled to exercise all of their rights under the Bill of Rights and the Civil War amendments and the Constitution equally. So I consistently defended people all across the spectrum, but I was a pretty partisan Republican. I mean, from the first moments that I can remember paying attention to politics, or in Reagan's first term, he was elected when I was 11. I admired Ronald Reagan from, a young age. And I considered myself, and one of my core identities was I was a Republican. I was a Christian, a conservative, I'm a Republican. And, and that's just, a core part of who I was. And I was so kind of a partisan that I remember giving a speech at a conservative gathering. This is before I deployed. And I talk about this in the book as something I'm really not proud of. And someone asked me, well, why are you both a soldier? I was in the Army Reserve as a JAG officer and a religious liberty and pro-life litigator in your civilian life. And I said, well, I think the two great threats to the United States of America are radical leftists at home and jihadists abroad. And I feel called to fight both. Well, everyone cheered, applause, applause. And then I go overseas and I saw what an actual enemy was.
Mm.
And, we fought my unit, 2nd Squadron, 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, fought the precursor to ISIS. They had already begun to change their name from Al Qaeda in Iraq to the Islamic Caliphate in Iraq. And all of the horrible, deadly, terrible things that you saw ISIS do in 2014, 2015, they were doing in 2007, 2008 in Iraq with much less international publicity. And so I saw two things. One, I saw what an enemy actually was,
Mm.
which made me really ashamed that I even used like sort of radical leftists and jihadists in the same sentence. I mean, after all, I went to law. I lived for 3 years in Cambridge, Massachusetts when I went to Harvard. I lived 2 years in Ithaca, New York when I taught at Cornell. Ithaca, I think, had a socialist mayor at that time. I lived in Center City, Philadelphia, very left wing. I lived in Manhattan, very left wing. This is all after I grew up in Tennessee and Kentucky. And I had a good life in all of those places. I mean, I disagreed with the public policy and certainly some of the radical folks on on both the Harvard and Cornell campuses had an intolerant and illiberal streak to them, but nobody was beheading anybody.
Mhm.
You know, it was all peaceful. It was all within the bounds of political combat, you know, well, and combat's the wrong word, all within the bounds of political conflict as opposed to actual combat, like, you know, existed in Iraq. And so I just felt really ashamed that I sort of lumped people together in those categories, even though I didn't say where they were the same, just even using them in the same sentence. I felt really bad about that. And then, and it betrayed sort of a problem with my partisan mindset. And
Mm.
then the other thing that I noticed was, and this was really fascinating to me because when I deployed, I was in an area that was consumed with Sunni Shia conflict. So I interacted with Shia police officers. I also interacted with Sunni tribal leaders and Shia military, you know, mainly Shia military and police, mainly Sunni tribal leaders. And one of the things I found out was that, you know, these guys weren't fighting each other because they had differences in policy. They weren't even really fighting each other because they had differences in theology, although there are ancient differences between Sunni and Shia theology. They were fighting each other because they had grievances against each other. And these
Mm.
grievances were rooted in awful things like the Shia killed my cousin or the Sunni killed my uncle. And so I came home to a country that was dividing and increasingly dividing. And what I saw was the two things that I was most worried about. One was describing your political opponents as enemies and
Mm.
sort of putting existential frames around political disagreements. And then the other one was the division was around a lot of times lists of grievances. It wasn't so much, hey, I'm really angry at the Democrats because they want to raise my taxes 4%. You know, it was, I'm really angry at the Democrats because of what they did to Robert Bork, to Clarence Thomas, to, you know, and as time went by, to Brett Kavanaugh, to the Covington Catholic kids. I'm really angry at the And so you begin to have this sort of list of things that the other side did that made you furious and convinced you that they really despise you. And so as America was growing more partisan, I was kind of going less partisan.
Mm.
As America was becoming more entrenched in grievances, I was becoming less entrenched in grievances. And so it was because I see the grievances as very, very dangerous. And so that's sort of the biographical frame that really kind of started to make me wake up and be really alarmed at what was going on.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, this sentence on page 9 really stood out to me. You said, "My time in Iraq changed my regard for my fellow citizens, especially my political opponents. If I had been willing to die for them while wearing the uniform of my country, why should I regard them as mortal enemies today?" And I
Right.
just appreciate the humanity of that and the sense of proportion of that. So maybe we can come back to that in a second. But first, for people who haven't read the book yet, part one, maybe you can just give us a sort of synopsis of, you talk about the geographic separation, the
Hmm.
intolerance, and then the polarization. Maybe just focusing on polarization for a moment. Could you just unpack, like, what are the warning signs of that? What are the examples of
Yeah.
that? How do you see that?
Yeah. So I began, you know, the opening paragraph of the book is pretty right up front. It says, you know, the continued unity of the United States can't be guaranteed, and that we have no truly important social, cultural, political, or religious force that's pulling us together more than it's pushing us apart.
Hmm.
And so in part one, I go about sort of proving that assertion. And the most important sort of frame around it is what you have to realize is that Americans are clustering into like-minded enclaves. This is called the big sort. It's a concept that comes from a Bill Bishop 2009 book that was noticing this trend, and it's only gotten worse. So the chances of you living around people who disagree with you profoundly are less and less and less. Huge percentage of Americans live in what are called landslide counties, where one side or the other wins a presidential contest by 20 points or more. So
Hmm.
you tend to be around like-minded communities. Well, what does that mean? That has an effect on people. And one of the effects is outlined by Cass Sunstein in a 1999 paper called The Law of Group Polarization. And so what that means is when people who are like-minded gather, they tend to become more extreme. They don't tend to become more reasonable. They tend to become more entrenched in their position, and their position tends to be more extreme. To make this concrete, let's suppose you oppose restrictions on the Second Amendment. If you gather with fellow gun rights advocates for dinner and you're all talking against restrictions on the Second Amendment, then you're going to leave the dinner more committed to gun rights. It's not like all of everyone agreeing with you makes you less committed. Or another way I've put it in speeches, I'll say, how many of you have gone to a really good Bible study and left it loving Jesus less? When you're around people who reinforce your point of view, you grow more entrenched in that point of view. And what Sunstein found was that there's even a cascade type effect where you can go into a deliberation as a group, and the more you reinforce each other, you can end that deliberation more extreme than the most extreme person at the start of the meeting, at the start of the deliberation.
Interesting.
And which is fascinating. And so we see this all across the United States, where Team Red and Team Blue gets extremely entrenched into positions, so much so that they do not like to hear disagreement about those positions. And in fact, disagreement in those positions can sort of cast you out of the team. And so if you're in these geographic enclaves and you're like-minded and you're becoming more extreme, you have less capacity to have empathy or understanding for the people in the other geographic enclave that is also happening to become more extreme. And I talk about how a lot of the research is showing that, we used to have this kind of bell curve with the big majority of Americans were sort of in the center right, center left, or in the center. And that's flattening out to where there's more and more and more people clustered at each end of the spectrum. And it doesn't mean the whole country is extremist. It's not like it's become a U quite yet, as opposed to that, bell shape. But what it means is there's just more people clustered at the edges.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, what I found comforting about the book is you're saying we need to go back to the wisdom of the founding fathers to address the situation we're in, and that to some extent, at least, they did actually envision that this is a circumstance we could find ourselves in. So you talk a lot about James Madison's Federalist Paper number 10, and I thought it might be helpful just to have you unpack that a little bit. What's the relevance of that?
Federalist Paper number 10 is my favorite Federalist paper. It should be your favorite Federalist paper. Everybody should have a favorite Federalist paper, but it's so essentially one of the things that we often, because we're always looking through the prism at history through the prism of the present. So, if we're going to think about the American founding, yes, absolutely, this was led by property owning white males who were Christian mainly, not exclusively, but Christian to some extent. And when you look at that through modern eyes, that doesn't sound like a very diverse founding at all. It's like, what a subslice of a population. That's not diversity. But in their own frame of reference, they had enormous diversity and division from within their own frame of reference. And all you have to do is sort of go down the eastern seaboard of the US, and you have Puritan Massachusetts, you have Rhode Island that was founded, in many ways by people who were ejected from Puritan Massachusetts. You had, a high concentration of Quakers in Pennsylvania. You had Catholics in Maryland. You had a lot of Anglicans in Virginia. You had criminals in Georgia, where they still remain. But you had all of these different religious subgroups. And to us, we look at that now and go, big deal. If you live in the South, you can drive down a street and you're going to see all these different denominations represented like next door to each other. Mm-hmm. But in that time, it was a big deal. In fact, you were not that far removed from the wars of religion that had torn apart the European continent to a scale not ever seen again until probably not until World War I, maybe the Napoleonic Wars, but definitely not until World War I. And so they were trying to figure out, how do we keep together a country that has all of these competing factions in it, factions that just had very recently torn apart Europe. And in fact, it had torn apart Europe so much that a lot of these factions had to flee Europe to come to the US. And what James Madison does is he says, he raises the question in Federalist 10, how do you deal with the violence of faction? That was the concern. And what he essentially said was, look, the way you deal with it is by allowing many factions to flourish.
Hmm.
It's it's not by trying to suppress faction, which often means suppressing liberty, but by allowing many factions to flourish. And that's not just, and this is what's so critical, it's not just individual liberty, it's community association. It is that right of freedom of association, the right to form communities that express particular ideas and values. And so this is laid out when George Washington, almost 50 times in his writing, refers to Micah 4:4, and Lin-Manuel Miranda repopularized this in the musical Hamilton.
Hmm.
Every man shall sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. And these are words that Washington sent to the Hebrew congregation of Rhode Island in a famous letter to this incredibly persecuted religious minority that was really wondering where its place, what kind of place would Jews have in the American story. And Washington assured them, every man shall live under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. And so what this means is that the solution, as America becomes increasingly diverse, we cannot seek to dominate those diverse communities that oppose us. Instead, we should seek to accommodate. That the answer is not domination, the answer is accommodation. The answer to diversity is allowing, or the response to our increasing diversity is allowing many different communities to flourish, rather than trying to impose upon many different communities values that they may not share.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, today it seems both on the right and on the left, there's an increasing number of people who do want domination and they
Yes.
don't want pluralism. In fact, I think that idea of pluralism can feel personally threatening to people. When you're talking to people, just as a matter of strategy, how do you help cultivate this value of living in a pluralistic society?
Yeah. Well, one of the things you have to do when you're talking about pluralism is you have to shed people of their utopianism. Because pluralism is not utopianism. It's not. I like the way that a pseudonymous writer named Scott Alexander put sort of the liberalism, small l liberalism, classical liberalism, pluralism. He described it as the best civil war avoidance mechanism ever created by the mind of man. So what you're talking about is you have to sort of say, okay, look, and what you have to also realize is a lot of that domination is the desire to dominate is built around fear. It's him or me.
Yeah.
It's us or them. And the plural, when you're talking about pluralism, you say, no, it's not us or them. It's us and them.
Mhm.
It's him and me. And so what you have to do is you have to, I think there's a couple of things. One, it's very pragmatic. It's very pragmatic. You just have to say, look, nobody's going to be able to dominate anybody in the society. The quest for domination, though, could tear us to pieces. Everyone sort of tries to spin out this theory that says we're going to win and we're going to win forever. And against all historical evidence, no, nobody's winning and winning forever. You might win an election here, win an election there. A cultural trend might go in your favor in one way and not in your favor another way. You need to get over this idea that you can have final victory over your opponents. As a matter of pragmatism, another matter of pragmatism is if you give a government enough power to dominate, how can you be sure you're going to run that government from now and forever? Whatever power you give the government is the exact power you give the government to inflict pain back on you if you don't run it. And this is one of the hardest things to get through to people, because when they're winning, it's sort of this natural human inclination to say, this is the way things should be. Now, let's make policy according to this present reality. And then 3 years later, there's sort of, and you just see this all the time. You see this in, executive orders. Well, Congress isn't doing what I want, so here we go with the executive orders. Then that president loses, in comes a new president, and they go, yeah, executive orders. I like those. And, it just keeps going and going and going. And so there's a pragmatic argument that essentially says, not only can you not dominate in perpetuity, not only can you not destroy your opposition, whatever tools you give the government to destroy your opposition can flip around and use on you when you're not in power.
Mhm.
And that reality keeps raising the stakes of our politics. And so it then is a principled frame, as a sort of a moral argument for pluralism. I go back to Micah 4:4. Isn't this a moral framework that we can agree to? Every man shall live under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. Now, that doesn't mean, for example, from a Christian standpoint, that you give up on evangelism. When I think of pluralism, I think of distinct communities with very porous walls between them. You can leave one community and go to another. So, what is evangelism? Evangelism is sort of a beckoning, come, know Jesus, become part of Christ's church, which means that, for many people, it's not just it's a heart change, it's a community change, it's a fundamental transformation. Pluralism welcomes that. It welcomes that give and take of ideas. It welcomes that mobility between worldviews and that mobility between associations. That's all part of pluralism. But what you have to do is you have to approach a pluralistic society with confidence. You can't sort of say, "Oh, I'm nervous about being a Christian here.
Mhm.
I'm scared about being a Christian here." You have to say, "I am confident in my faith. I am confident in my expression, and I'm going to participate fully in this marketplace of ideas, even if I get blowback, because you will. Because guess what? In a pluralistic society, other people have rights to speak too.
Mhm.
Other people have their rights to form their associations too. So you have to enter into it with confidence, but it's not utopian. There's always going to be friction. There's always going to be friction between competing worldviews, but it's manageable friction. It's not catastrophic friction.
Yeah. Another one of the things I really appreciate about your book and your voice in general is the call for civility. And one of the things that scares me the most right now is how many people are saying civility is actually a weakness. The threats against us are so dire that we actually need something
Yeah.
uncivil. That's actually the strength that we need. I believe civility takes a greater and nobler kind of strength. Um, could you talk about that and just the value of civility?
Well, first, it's just flat out wrong to say that civility is inconsistent with courage, or that civility equates in any way with weakness. I agree with you completely. When everyone is saying be indecent, when everyone is saying lash out, and you're saying no, that requires strength. It absolutely requires strength. Look, as a Christian, um, well, and we need to define our terms. Civility is not necessarily self-defining. I look at it when I talk about civility in a Christian context. I think of exhibiting the fruits of the Spirit. I think of blessing those who curse you, loving your enemies, demonstrating real kindness. Micah 6:8, act justly, love kindness or love mercy, and walk humbly before the Lord. All of these things are commands. They're not tactics. There's not a comma that follows these commands that says, do this unless you feel like you're losing. And so what ends up happening is people who raise the specter of, oh, well, we're losing. And kindness doesn't work, or, blessing those who persecute you doesn't work. That's not the calculus for a Christian. That's not the calculus.
Mhm.
The calculus, this is a command, not a tactic. So you have faith. And this is where faith comes in. If you have everyone in the world saying, you have to do unto others as they're doing unto you in politics, you have to have the faith that even if it appears that it's more effective to engage in the sort of the cruelty of modern political culture, you have to have faith that God protects his people, even when they are, and especially when they are cutting against the grain of the culture. And so it's very disappointing to me to see Christians who sort of, in many other areas of life, would not say that we should compromise on these core values. But then when it comes into politics, they go, well, it's just too important. It's just too important. And so, as far as civility and decency go, again, when you're talking about a command, you can't treat it as a tactic. And that doesn't mean you don't stand on conviction and principle. And I have litigated case after case, filed lawsuit after lawsuit to vindicate religious liberty and the First Amendment. But I've done my best to, behave with decency and honesty and humility and kindness, even to the people I'm litigating against in the course of my cases. There is absolutely nothing inconsistent between standing on the principles that you believe in and defending those principles with honesty, with kindness, and with humility. And I'll tell you this, you don't comply with the scriptural commands by hiring somebody, a politician, a talk radio host, a primetime cable host, hiring them either by voting for them or by watching them and supporting them, to hate your enemies for you.
Mm.
You cannot delegate your hatred to other people and maintain clean hands.
That's good. What do you think are some practical steps that private citizens can take to reduce the polarization that's happening? So, for example, one thing I think about a great deal is just having friends with whom you disagree, but you're still friends and you don't withdraw from that. Another is news intake. Check out multiple sources for your news. Social media, monitoring the impact that may be having upon you.
Right.
What
Those
else?
are all very good. Those are all very good suggestions. I basically boil it down to a few things, because one of the things is because we cluster off so much and we live in communities that are very like-minded. Sometimes when you say, well, have friends outside of your religious, political, economic sort of circles, it's hard to do that. It's hard to do that. Especially when people are living and interacting so much with people who are like themselves. But so I think of it like this. One, here's a very basic thing. Read the best expression of the opposing side's point of view. In other words, don't learn about ideas that you might disagree with from their opponents, from the idea of the opponents of the ideas. Learn about ideas from their proponents. In other words, the people who are advancing the idea, read them. I'll take a super, super, super hot button. Let's just dive into something that's super hot button, especially in like Southern Baptist circles right now, even though I'm not Southern Baptist, I'm PCA. Critical race theory. Okay. All of the Southern Baptist Seminary presidents united to condemn critical race theory. A lot of people are super curious about critical race theory. And here's how you should not learn about critical race theory: by going to your favorite like-minded theologians to see what they say about critical race theory and think that you've learned about it. Instead, go and read critical race theorists and then go read their critics. Do you see what I'm saying? So in other words, go to the proponent of an idea as opposed to an opponent of an idea. First, read the opponent, read the rebuttal, but first read what we're talking, read the advocates. And so what you end up doing, what you'll invariably end up with, is a much more nuanced view of the issue. Yeah. And it also is ends up humanizing your political opponents to a much greater degree than if you're exclusively reading from their critics. So that's one thing. The other thing you can do is defend the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself. And I don't mean that just if you're a lawyer watching. I mean, if you're on social media and you see somebody, a news story that your friends are talking about where a political opponent is being treated unfairly, stand up for the political opponent. You don't have to agree with their underlying ideas, but you can stand up against the unfair treatment. And what ends up happening is that it penetrates groupthink, and it creates real bonds of fellowship with people on the other side of the aisle. People are grateful when those who disagree with them stand up on points of common principle. And then the other thing is, to the extent that you're engaged in, let me put it this way. If you are a very politically interested person, don't let politics be a hobby. Make it a practice. So in other words, if you're super politically interested, there's a lot of people who spend an enormous amount of time treating politics almost like it's like it's SEC football. Like, I'm going to learn everything about the different players. I'm going to fight about it on the message boards. I'm going to listen to it on the radio, as opposed to saying, hey, what about, there's a local zoning issue or a local issue regarding, funding of the local police department, or and then just getting engaged with actual human beings in political activity as opposed to thinking and opining about it. I think it's one of the things that does when you get engaged. So just super basic stuff. I spent 6 years on the school board of my kids' Christian school. That's politics of a kind, it's governance of a kind. And one of the first things you learn when you're involved in any kind of political endeavor, as opposed to opining about it constantly, is that this stuff is complicated and hard. It's not easy. And all of the people who are running around going, these idiots, if they only knew, if they had only had any bit of courage of their convictions, then you actually get involved and you're like, oh, okay. So there's these competing constituencies, and there's these competing interests, and there's this really complicated budgetary angle. Yikes. and so one of the things I think is political hobbyism is a little bit dangerous. Political participation is often quite humbling.
Yeah, that's so good. So getting into the third part of the book a little bit, the way forward here. In chapter 16, you talk about tolerance and what is real tolerance. And I love this. I laughed out loud when you quoted the university that had declared acts of intolerance will not be tolerated. So, but you're making the broader point that many people think of tolerance as only with people you already agree with.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
could you
And
talk about true tolerance?
Yeah, I really love the way, again, I'll go back to this pseudonymous writer named Scott Alexander, who psychologist living in a very blue area of the country, talking to his peers and saying, are you tolerant? Yeah, of course I'm tolerant. I mean, I love people regardless of they're gay, straight, white, black. I mean, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity. And then Scott follows up with the question, well, what's wrong with them? And then there's like, wait a minute, what do you mean what's wrong with them? What do you think I am, a bigot? And he says, well, then what are you tolerating? And it really raised clarified, what is tolerance? Tolerance is not affection. It is not a synonym for affection. And so when people call themselves tolerant, what they often mean is I have a great deal of affection for people who are within my in-group, regardless of various other identities they might have. What Alexander says, tolerance is really tested by your commitment to the members of an out-group. People who are not in your tribe. People who are not in agreement with you. Tolerance implies there's something to tolerate, right? And so that's when I talk about that we have to rediscover what tolerance actually is, because we have to understand that tolerance means that there is something that bothers us. There is something that we have to tolerate. And it's an absolutely critical part of, understanding our American system. It is actually built to recognize the rights and dignity and humanity, although it hasn't always done this in practice, but it's built to actually sort of codify tolerance in an interesting kind of way. But yeah, we have lost the meaning of tolerant, and we have to rediscover it.
Yeah. Another thing that I appreciate about the book is setting current events in light of history, and especially legal history. So you talk about football players kneeling during the national anthem, and you set that in the broader context of, and I'll read this so I make sure I get it right, but the West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, 1942 Supreme Court decision, which I didn't know anything about before I read the book. But could you explain that a little bit of how that is relevant to the current situation?
Yeah. So, one of the things I talk about in the spirit of defend the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself, I talk about this phenomenon of cancel culture and how conservatives are very aware of cancel culture. And for example, I talk about the story of James Damore, this Google software engineer who was fired after he put forward libertarianish suggestions for how Google can can increase diversity without engaging in discrimination. And he got fired. People got upset. People got mad. There was no evidence that he was like actually harming anybody in the workplace, but he got fired. And so conservatives were like, look how intolerant Google is. Well, then Colin Kaepernick and a few football players kneel during the national anthem. And the president of the United States says, fire them. And conservatives said, no, Mr. President, we don't like cancel culture. No, that's not what happened. A lot of conservatives said, yeah, get rid of them. Look at what they're doing. And that really distressed me as from two standpoints. One, I mean, if you're going to be against cancel culture, be against cancel culture, right? The other one is there was something particularly offensive to me with from a constitutional standpoint about the president of the United States demanding that these people stand. And what was offensive to me is it really violated the spirit of West Virginia v. Barnett, which is one of the most important constitutional cases in American history. And this involved, at the very onset of World War II, the West Virginia Board of Education required all students to stand and salute the flag. Well, a couple of Jehovah's Witnesses, they believed that was idolatry. It's not that they weren't patriotic. They just believed it was idolatry to salute the flag like that and refused to salute the flag and faced punishment. So they filed suit. And the Supreme Court, in the middle of the most, ever since the Civil War, the war that was the single greatest existential threat, not just to the existence of the U.S., but Western civilization, came down with words that said if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it's that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what is orthodox in law, politics, religion, nationalism, and enshrined that said we are confident enough in our nation, in the values that hold our nation together, that we're not going to compel someone to salute the flag against their conscience. And then fast forward to 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. And then to have, a political movement saying, how dare you? How dare you? And I'm going to endorse reprisals against you if you don't stand and salute. It's forgetting this fundamental constitutional principle. It's this, and I would urge people to read the entire West Virginia v. Barnett opinion. It's actually really powerfully written. And it's one of the Supreme Court's finest moments, that it resisted in the middle of this war, this impulse to make everybody conform to the same action and point of view, which weren't we fighting for liberty? So to protect liberty, even as you fight for liberty. And now, of course, the Supreme Court wasn't perfect about that. It had one of the worst cases in Supreme Court history around the same time, Korematsu, where they permitted the internment of Japanese Americans. So yeah, the Supreme Court wasn't completely solid in that time, but that was a very solid decision.
Yeah. Well, one last question. In the conclusion, you talk about courage and the importance of courage in addressing these things, and especially you talk about the courage to stand up against your own constituency,
Yeah.
and how important that is in the healing of our nation. Could you unpack a little bit of why that is so important?
Yeah. One of the things, if you're going to read this book and you're going to think, oh, I can't wait to read this book to learn all the ways that the progressives are awful, or if you're going to say, I'm going to read this book and I'm going to learn all the way those conservatives are loathsome, and to vindicate my point of view on all things, don't buy the book. This is not an own the libs book. It's not an own the conservatives book. It's a book that says that we have two tribes that have some real problems, I'm not, in one area, the left might be worse than the right, and another area, the right might be worse to the left. I'm not adjudicating who's got more problems. Okay. What I'm saying is we have two tribes that have a lot of problems. And the other thing is, as is so often the case, the problematic elements of each side thrive off of opposition from their opponents. So in other words, if the only people taking on the illiberal left are on the right, that doesn't deter the illiberal left. That's who they exist to combat. And the same thing with the illiberal right. If the only people who are taking on authoritarians and people who are corrupt and cruel on the right are liberals or people on the left, Well, that's who these right-wing folks exist to fight. But what they're not as good at dealing with, and what they're not equipped to deal with, are people on the right who are saying to others, this is wrong. This is not this is not who we are. This is not what we should be. And those individuals are the most effective, in some cases, the only people who are effective at dealing with the cruel and malicious elements on Team Red or on Team Blue. And so if you sit there and you say, I'm somebody who fights against authoritarianism, censorship, cancel culture, and you never turn your fire onto your own team when it commits those sins, you're part of the problem, to be honest. You're part of the problem. All you are is you're a partisan. You're a partisan at the core. You're still just basically partisan. But if you say, here are key values that apply to all of us, and that my own side is bound to follow, should follow these values as well, and you hold your own side's feet to the fire, then I think you're part of the solution. And fortunately, there are a growing number of people on the left and on the right who see the problems on their own side and realize that we have to do something about it. You know, I have friends, on the left, my great friend Yasha Monk, who started a site called Persuasion, that is, as he calls it, a fighting institution designed to fight illiberalism. In other words, the disregard of individual liberty, the creeping authoritarianism that you see on both far right and far left, wherever it crops up. So he'll write things, condemning things that are happening on the right, and he'll write things that are condemning things that are happening on the left. We have to have that. We have to. But it's very hard. It is easy to constantly feed your own team a steady diet of information that it likes. And even if you confine yourself to only fair criticisms of the left, that's what you do. I'm not going to make the unfair criticisms like other people do. I'm going to only make fair criticisms. So long as your fair criticisms are exclusively on one side, I'm sorry, you're part of the problem.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, I will ask you one more question so that we end on an upswing here. When you look to the future of our nation, what are the things that give you hope? What are the things that encourage you that healing and unity is still possible?
Well, we've been through worse. That's one thing. This country is really interesting in that it's not a history that says, everything, we've been really unified and we haven't had to deal with deep and intense divisions, except for that one period when we dealt with slavery, then we dealt with slavery and we have gone through a lot of periods of upheaval. And by and large, we've not only emerged from them, we've emerged from them better. So to the extent that you can sort of look back on history and say, what does history teach us about our ability to emerge from these periods of division and crisis? Well, it should give us a degree of confidence, that we can do it. We can do this. We absolutely can do this. We have done this. Now, to use the standard disclaimer you read in like a securities prospectus, past performance is no guarantor of future results. So the past can't make us complacent, but it can give us some reassurance that we have this capacity of Americans is to rise above even very deep and profound divisions. And the other thing is there's a lot of really smart, courageous, interesting individuals who are waking up to this problem all at the same time. It hasn't yet filtered into the grassroots nearly as much as you'd like to see. But the reality is there's a lot of people on the right and on the left who are saying, wait a minute, we're heading in a bad direction. This authoritarianism, this cruelty, this malice, this is getting out of hand. And so when you have people who are very smart, some of them have very large constituencies and followers, large numbers of followers, when they're together saying, we got a problem, that's your seeds of hope. That's your seeds of renewal. So it isn't as if the forces of division and polarization are unopposed. They are opposed. It's just that the forces of division and polarization are a little bit stronger right now. That doesn't mean they'll always be stronger.
Well, let me encourage everyone watching this to buy and read David French's book, Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. And David, thank you so much for writing the book, and thanks so much for this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.